Hello everyone, welcome to one more lecture of this self-knowledge course. In the previous lecture, we learned about some laws of force.
Hello everyone.
If you remember, we talked about the law of octaves and the law of entropy, and about how we can take advantage of the current of sound or current of life to raise our inner work in higher octaves. And we learn how to counteract that law of entropy that constantly leads us to lose the strength in whatever we undertake. In today's lecture, we'll see how, after strongly embarking on this path that will lead us to achieve the great purpose of our existence, which is to achieve self-realization of our being, to awaken 100% of our consciousness, to reach that goal by making us a permanent center of gravity in relation to our consciousness that allow us to have a continuity of purpose and perseverance in this work towards self-knowledge. So, let's see that the objective of today's lecture will be to understand the importance of dedicating our entire existence to our inner work and how to achieve continuity of purposes. That is what will ensure us the success in this path. And to get into the context of this topic, let's first see what a center of gravity is. We know that the law of gravity applies in the entire universe. We see how the planets go around the sun, and we see the moons, how they go around the planets, attracted by a gravitational force that keeps them permanently spinning in that orbit. It is thanks to this that the universe maintains an order, an organization. Otherwise, everything would be scattered and without any order. So, the center of gravity is that point where all the forces or the energies converge. But we, in our psychology, also have a center of gravity. The interesting thing is to discover where we have placed that gravitational point, whether we revolve all the time around our personality or if we revolve around our consciousness. Actually, in the state we currently are, we tend to always gravitate around the things of the personality. But if we want to begin to advance in our spiritual work, we must begin to revolve around our consciousness. We must learn to transform this center of gravity so that we can achieve everything we set out to do in relation to our spiritual work. Because if all our forces and all our energies are focused on the same point, then that objective will gain strength. And if one is seriously thinking of achieving self-realization, of transforming from a human personality to a solar man, and from a solar man to a superman, and from a superman to an absolute man, there needs to be a continuity of purpose. Every human being has a center of gravity. And that center of gravity will be in what we dedicate ourselves to with continuity of purposes. We'll see that if we have continuity of purposes based on an objective, it is certain that we will be able to achieve it. But if we are dispersed, we will never obtain any results. And this not only happens in the inner work, but also it happens in any aspect of our lives. For example, if a person, or let's say a person who has practiced the piano since he was a child, devoting a good number of hours to his daily practice and with our continuity of purpose towards that goal, which is to be the best pianist of his time, when he grows up, he achieves this goal because he had a continuity of purpose. Unlike anyone else who didn't have that strength, that continuity of purpose. And it is clear that we are going for higher goals than any temporary achievement that the personality can reach, since we are going for self-realization. And if our goal is really to achieve liberation, to reach enlightenment by awakening 100% of our consciousness, our time and our energies must be focused on that goal, which is to become a solar man. But what happens? That as within us we are not one, but we are many, as we studied in the Radical Change lecture, it is very difficult for us to have a continuity of purposes. We actually want to self-realize ourselves, but we don't have a responsible individual within us who can achieve that goal. The only responsible individual that could lead us to reach that goal is our consciousness. But our consciousness almost never expresses itself in us because we don't let it express itself. On the contrary, we have a multiplicity of psychological defects that are the ones that control our physical body, this human machine. And each one of those individuals that live inside us, they think differently. They are each independent of it, and they have, and each one have their own interests and their own concepts. We can actually verify this by remembering any moment in which we have chosen and bought something, and we were very excited about it. And a few days later, we start seeing defects on that thing, and we find that the other model is more beautiful or is better. So we see how we can change our ways of thinking from one moment to the other. Or in the same example of a musical instrument, I don't know if it has happened to you. It has to me. Being very excited about learning how to play such an instrument, and you get to buy the instrument and you start the practices with encouragement. But as more and more skill is required, or more continuity of purpose is required to achieve a skill, then another self comes, very different from the one who wants so much to learn to play the guitar with so much enthusiasm, and the one expressing now is interested better in spending it watching a series that has just been released, or in dedicating himself to anything else. And that is where that musical longing just ends. And it is that what a self, what a psychological I affirms at a given moment cannot take any seriousness, because after a few hours we think differently. As long as there is not a responsible individual within us who is like this spokesperson who positively guides our physical body, in this case that responsible individual is our consciousness, then it will be difficult to have a continuity of purpose in something. Many people live inside us. Each one of them has their own way of thinking and their own way of doing things. You know that 97% of our essence is trapped in our multiplicity of negative ways of being. What we want today, we hate tomorrow. What we are passionate about today, we just dislike tomorrow. What interests us today loses interest tomorrow. And that is the reason why it is so difficult for us to achieve objectives, to achieve goals. And therefore, it is the same thing that will not allow us to achieve that final objective or that great purpose of our existence, which is to achieve total liberation and the awakening of 100% of our consciousness. As long as we don't learn to have a continuity of purposes in psychological death, so that our consciousness can constantly manifest itself, we will not be that responsible individual who seriously brings his inner work to a successful conclusion. As we saw, inside a person, many people live. Then the full sense of responsibility doesn't really exist in us. Many people have a longing for self-realization, and they received this knowledge and they have a lot of strength. However, very few remain and reach the final goal. And this is because as long as there is not a permanent center of gravity around that objective and a continuity of purposes in the aspects that will lead us to that objective, we won't make it. The self that today wants to self-realize, tomorrow is replaced by another that is more interested in the things of life and the things of the personality. And the thing is that this work is totally practical and we have to do it by ourselves. No one is going to do this work for us. No one is going to save us from ourselves. At most, messengers will come to show the way and demonstrate with their lives that liberation and enlightenment are actually possible. But the work itself has to be done by each one of us individually. Therefore, if we want to advance in this work, we must start creating a permanent center of gravity around this. Many people come strongly to these studies and with a lot of encouragement, but after a while they lose that encouragement and they don't want to know anything about this knowledge or about inner work or about psychological death or about meditation or whatever. It is also the case that many withdraw for any reason, fair or unfair, complicated or simple, and then they tend to join or enter different pseudo-esoteric schools where they are asked for a registration or an economic contribution in exchange for a belief or make them believers of something, making them believe that by attending those meetings or cults and by giving that economic contribution, they will achieve internal progress, that they are internally advanced. And this actually happens because a person didn't know how to maintain a continuity of purpose in the interior work and prefer to look where they offer and is salvation. Actually, the most normal thing is that people get excited at the prospect of being able to awaken their consciousness, and after a while they abandon that purpose. That is the most common thing. The strange thing, what very rarely happens, is that someone doesn't live the inner work and they manage to become a solar man. And the creation of the solar man is absolutely not possible if we don't first establish a permanent center of gravity within ourselves. But you may ask, what is a solar man? Well, let's look at this. A solar man is one who manages to develop within himself those solar germs that will allow him to create himself internally and serve the interests of the solar experiment. And what is the solar experiment? It is that creation that, let's say, God makes. God as the sacred absolute Son, which, as we saw in lecture number 28, where we talk about the individual and the universal Christ, that a sacred absolute Son is made up of a group of gods or a group of Christs that make up what is called the universal Christ. So, the solar experiment is that creation that the Son makes with the aim of being able to manufacture solar men, or men who has awakened 100% of their consciousness, men who actually develop their individual Christ or their inner fire, so that they become an active part of that universal Christ, our sacred absolute Son. The reason why the universe, the galaxies, the planets, the human beings of this and other planets were created is so that the sparks that emanate from that absolute Son, and that everyone within us has a divine spark, will have the possibility of becoming solar men. That is the reason. Although science doesn't admit it or doesn't know it, the vast majority of planets in the solar system have intelligent life, and that life exists for the same purpose: to get men who work on themselves, who are self-realized, and that incarnate out of all evil their intimate Christ. That is the purpose of all creation. And for this, within each human being, there are some solar germs that allow this objective to be fulfilled. And what are those solar germs? Well, they are the creative sexual energy that is found in our sexual gonads, in the testicles, in the case of the man, and in the woman in the ovaries. So, using the sexual transmutation of that energy in a correct way, we can create ourselves, meaning that we are all a potential solar man. But what's going on? That not all solar germs germinate or develop. Not all seeds germinate. Most are lost. As we can see in that famous parable of the sower that is in the Bible, that some of the seeds fall on the road and are eaten by the pigeons, I think. Other fall on stones. They germinate but cannot take root and they dry up. And other falls among grasses or thorns and are covered and destroyed by them. And there are some of the seeds that fall on fertile ground, and they are the ones that actually germinate, that grow, and that develop. And this is the same that happens with us. We, all of us, have that seed or solar germs within us, but we must have favorable circumstances so that these seeds can develop. So, what are the requirements for that solar seed that we all have inside to germinate? Well, first we need to have three aspects of our body in good condition: the mind, the spine, and the sexual apparatus. The mind must be in good condition because it is with this that we can reflect about our psychological defects and our wrong ways of being. And it is with our mind that we can consciously imagine, like when we imagine how the energy is ascending from our sexual gonads all the way through our spine until it reaches the point between the eyes. We need to imagine that. And we need our mind to use our free will to be able to deny ourselves to our desires. So if a person has problems of the mind to the point that he can't even reflect then he wouldn't be able to do this inner work in this existence. And the second aspect, the spine, must be in good condition, since it is through our spinal cord that the creative sexual energy will rise and will create our existential bodies of the being with the practice of the suprasexuality. And the spine cannot have breaks. It could have a hernia or a deviation, that is not a problem. But if the spine is broken, then the energy cannot be raised. So this work cannot be done in this existence. And the sexual apparatus, if a person had a tubal cut or a vasectomy, or if the woman had her uterus removed, then would not be able to do the work of the sexual transmutation. There are cases in which the woman, for example, has a tubal ligation, but with another surgery, they can like reconnect this thing. Or in the case of the man that had a vasectomy, and with another surgery, they can connect that again. Then there, by reversing that, the person could have the opportunity of doing this work. But if the person had their uterus, ovaries removed, or if the man, for example, lost his sexual apparatus, it can no longer be rebuilt, then the person could not work on the factor of spiritual birth, can only work on the other two factors, so that in a future existence they receive a new physical body and can work on the three factors. In addition to having these three aspects in normal state, the person must have the objective knowledge of the three factors for the consciousness revolution focused on practice. The person needs to know this and have it very clear. Needs to know how the ongoing death is done, how the reflective meditation is done, how to create their existential bodies of being through the practice of the suprasexuality, and know the step-by-step of this practice, the requirements like the fidelity, chastity, and love, and needs to know how to produce dharma by working in favor of humanity. And having a physical body in a normal condition and having this knowledge clear, the third requirement will be to achieve that continuity of purposes in each of these practices that will ensure us to achieve success in that wonderful, wonderful purpose of our existence, that is, receive self-realization. But we must have clear that any race created by the sun has no other objective in nature than to serve to the interests of this creation and the solar experiment. As I was saying, all the sparks that come out of the Absolute come with that purpose. And from each of the races that have existed on the planet so far, the sun has achieved some triumphs, harvesting small groups of solar men who have been all those men who throughout the history of the planet they have managed to awaken their consciousness. But it happens that unfortunately the majority of humanity today is not interested in this work, and there are very few who have those three requirements that we are talking about. And it happens that if the sun fails in its experiment, it loses all interest in such a race, and it is condemned to destruction and evolution. Because when a race has given its fruits, it progressively disappears or violently perishes through great catastrophes. And this with the purpose that there be a process of revitalization of the planet and give way to the formation of a new race that begins its entire development process beginning with the golden age of that race. A practical example that we could see to understand the reason of this is that if we sow some seeds in the land and the land burns, or the land is not fertile and these seeds do not germinate, what would we do? Well, we would remove that damaged crop and we recondition the land again to plant another new crop. That will happen on this earth with this race. If this Aryan race, which is the fifth that this planet has given, no longer bears fruit and everyone definitely wants to degenerate, then it is doomed to destruction. This planet is actually at that point. It has already been condemned because there are almost no people really interested in regenerating. We are already very degenerate and we defend and celebrate our degeneration. So we are already living the final part of this race, since little by little it will be eliminated through catastrophes and wars. However, those who still want to work on themselves and manage to at least regenerate their physical body and their vital body will be able to be part of the exodus, and they could be the first settles of the next race. So we have to keep in mind, only by working on ourselves with true continuity of purposes and a full sense of moral responsibility can we become solar men. And this is going to imply that we consecrate the totality of our existence to the esoteric work on ourselves. Therefore, in order for us to achieve a center of gravity around our consciousness, which lead us to achieve the self-realization, the first thing we need to do is make the decision to consecrate our entire existence to achieving that purpose. This actually may be the most important decision that we can make in our lives. And if we really have that firm decision, we must know that in order to have a center of gravity around this decision, we need to dedicate our time to achieving this purpose. The center of gravity is actually summed up in one word: time. And our center of gravity will always be around what we spend the most time on. People usually have their center of gravity around their profession, like the doctor have their center of doctor has his center of gravity around his consultations and his prescriptions, etc. The housewife has her center of gravity in the things of her home, in her children, food, whatever. The musician in his rehearsals, his concerts, the architect in his works, whatever. But all the things belonging that belong to the personality, they can actually lead us to reach some material or personal fruits for this existence. However, they will not lead us to achieve anything that can transcend, nothing that really transcends time, or that can lead us to achieve the purpose of our existence. However, our 3%, our inner being, is not interested at all in the subjective things of personality. What our 3% really care about is about being born, creating the existential bodies of the being, about dying in itself, that is releasing and awakening consciousness constantly, and about helping others to know the path of self-realization. That is what we can call the profession or the work of our being. And it is our being, that 3%, who knows how to retrace the entire path that will take us back to the stars. Therefore, we must focus with continuity of purposes on the work of the being. But if we analyze what we spend our time on throughout the day, we'll see that we spend time with the family, with the material work, with the social commitments in leisure, like WhatsApp, Facebook, YouTube, watching movies, and the different things of the personality. And we can realize how little time we are actually dedicating to the things of the consciousness. Therefore, we must encourage ourselves to begin to make a gradual change to take time away from the personality and give it to the consciousness. And this change must be gradual, because when you make changes like phonetically, you don't get real results because you repent later. So the ideal is to take it off little by little. If we sleep, say for example, 9 hours, then we take 2 hours of sleep and we put 1 hour to our super sex practice and 1 hour on meditation. And we maintain those 2 hours over time. And we do it with determination, continuity of purposes. Then we take away a few hours that we previously dedicated to leisure, and we take them to do our practices of watch and pray, as we learned in lecture number 21. Our practices of transfer of funds that we learned in lecture number 13, or our practice of astral projection, and we sustain that over time. And so we gradually take time away from the personality and put some time into making some kind of sacrifice for humanity, like talking to others about the things that we learned and that we experienced with this knowledge, so they can know and experience by themselves, and we can start preparing ourselves to teach this knowledge, etc. And we need time for that. And above all, it's important to keep ourselves in constant self-observation and practicing the ongoing death to eliminate from moment to moment all those selves that want to manifest in us, leading us to lose strength and leading us to lose the interest in our own spiritual progress, and that we return to the things of the life and the personality. So it is important that we maintain that inner silence, so we can have that center of gravity around our own consciousness. So the wisdom of our Father can manifest in us through our hearts when we are in inner silence, when we are practicing the ongoing death. If we do it gradually, we will achieve self-realization. And to finish this lecture, I want to touch on this point that is very important that we take into account. Since all our ego is lunar, and it is not so easy to become a solar man when we carry the moon within us. In lecture number 9, when we talk about the infra dimensions that live in our lower abdomen, we talk about the fact that we have 2 moons in us, the visible moon and the invisible moon. And we talk about how the visible moon represents the fascination we have with the things of the personality and all those good defects that we have inside us and that we easily see but that we justify because we see them as something normal. And the invisible moon is the dark part of our psychology and represents the heaviest defects that we have, and that only comes out at certain times. But also, the Earth has 2 moons. The first is that moon that we all see at night, that is esoterically called known as Nahema. And the second, is called Lilith. And that one is a little more distant than the white moon. That is what is known as the black moon. Lilith, in her orbit, gets closer in certain parts of the year, and when she gets closer, she activates the heaviest defects in people's psychology. The most sinister forces of the ego reach Earth from Lilith and produced subhuman and bestial psychological results. The crimes of the Red Dress, the most monstrous murders in history, the most unsuspected crimes, and so on, are due to the vibratory weights of Lilith. And so it happens that when we receive those vibratory waves, we usually go into crisis. We don't want to meditate, we don't want to practice, etc. It is actually some short times during the year, and many people lose their strength at those times. That is why it is so important that in those moments of Christ to appeal to all our inner strength and not let ourselves be dragged, and that we maintain our continuity of purposes. Since whoever stands firm in those moments of crisis receives more inner strength to continue advances. So, to finish, I remind you that there are so many excuses in these questions, there are so many evasions, there are so many fascinating attractions that in fact it is often almost impossible to understand the urgency of the esoteric way. So I hope that we can reach that understanding and that this lecture has helped you to have clarity on how to achieve a permanent center of gravity around your inner work. And without more to add, I want to invite you to our next lecture, which will be seen next Sunday, where we will talk about a thorny but interesting topic in which we will understand many things in relation to the family and in relation to the attachment that we create around the people and around things. So don't miss that interesting topic next week. And thank you to all that joined the video, and have a happy rest of the day. See you next Sunday. Ciao, ciao.